Welcome everyone to the first ever AMWA After Hours. There will be a Q&A after the presentation, so when or if you have questions, please add them to the chat and we will address them during the Q&A section. Thank you so very much for being here this evening. This evening we will be discussing the topic Women in the Anschutz collection. The history of the American West is a male-dominated narrative of drifters, dreamers, hucksters, and heroes. This talk will highlight and give insight into the women often left out of this narrative or storybook tale. Today, we will be discussing 4 women artists within AMWA's collection. The first woman we will be discussing is Grace Carpenter Hudson. Hudson was born as a twin on February 21, 1865, in Potter Valley, Northern California. Her parents were among some of the first white settlers in Potter Valley and noticed how detrimental white settlers were to the Pawnee people's way of life. Eventually, a relationship grew between the Carpenters and Pawnee peoples as the family assisted in any way possible. Hudson's mother was the school teacher in Potter Valley, where they grew up. Grace was educated early on because of her mother's profession. The family would move to UKeefe when Grace was 4 years old. There was no high school in UKeefe, so Grace and her brother were sent to a school in San Francisco. By her 14th birthday in 1879, she was enrolled in the San Francisco School of Design. Here, Grace learned to draw the human form from sculptures and casts, eventually moving on to live models. Grace eventually met and married her second husband, John Wilkes Napier Hudson, a doctor, in 1890. It was around this time that Grace directed her artistic talents to documenting and portraying Pawnee peoples, aiming to represent them as accurately as possible. Likely in response to her husband's interest as an ethnographer. He learned the local language and she learned to approach her subjects scientifically with great attention to detail. Grasshopper Dance portrays such detail. In the puka shell necklace, headpiece, and feathers on the back of the figure. The figure is set on a white neutral background, common of her portraits. She borrows the technique from scientific illustration and anthropology. The most common comparison made is to Audubon's depictions of North American birds. Grace's first successful portrayals of Pawnee peoples were exhibited with great response. She completed several major portraits between 1892 and 1893. Exhibited them in the San Francisco Art Association, the Mechanics Fair in San Francisco, Minneapolis Exposition, Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and so on. One painting even found permanent home in the Smithsonian Institution during this time. In 1894, led to another successful year in terms of exhibitions and print reproductions in magazines and newspapers. It really served to put Pawnee peoples and the Northern California Valley near UKeefe on the Western art map. As Hudson was raised alongside Pawnee peoples, she really understood their culture better than many of her contemporary artists. She not only preserved the culture by ways of portraits, she also documented items of their culture that would later hold anthropological significance. She paid a great deal of attention to detail to such effect that viewers enjoyed looking at her paintings through a magnifying glass. Some even suggest that she painted with a magnifying glass. When Hudson found willing subjects or sitters, it was common for her to paint them multiple times. Sometimes she depicted her sitters at various ages, sometimes several times just in the course of a year. By 1895, Hudson exhibited alongside artists like George DeForest Rush, William Merritt Chase, Winslow Homer, and Whistler, among many more. The years between 1913 and 1925 were the peak of Hudson's artistic career, with special attention to detail and striving for accuracy and refinement in each individual work. She died in 1937 with an unknown amount of her total body of work being destroyed in the 1905 San Francisco earthquake. Grasshopper Dance appears in her catalog raisonné of 1978. However, the portraits in the museum do not. The two portraits in the collection are of Pawnee Leaders, completed in 1905 during Hudson's commission by the Field Museum to paint and document the Pawnee people of Oklahoma. The works remained in Hudson's possession until 1933, even though they were commissioned so much earlier. When speaking of these two portraits, Hudson stated, for Chief Rhoone, quote, Rhoone Chief was noted for his great height and dignity. Rhoone Chief was a very large man. His shoulders were broad, and his 6 feet 4 inches in height gave him the appearance of a majestic column. His taste in dress is attractive. He uses green ribbons in his hair and clustered metallic earrings. In an unusual spirit of ambition, Rhoone Chief built a 2-story white house, but he soon tired of it and went back to a tent, leaving the house for the woodpeckers, end quote. In relation to Chief Rhone's wife's portrait, as seen here, Hudson states, quote, Mrs. Rhoone Chief is a happy, kindly matron. Her 6 children are in the government boarding school. The big house is abandoned, so she sits in her little tent and makes beautiful hand-embroidered garments with sinew and buckskin. End quote. The scientific approach to subject and dress is extremely evident in the jewelry depicted in both portraits. There is an unfinished nature to these portraits as the paint fades at the chest of the bust. However, much detail is given to the silver ball earrings, bear claw necklace, and the medal that is donned by Chief Rhoone. Hudson produced a total of 684 numbered portraits, 3 of which are in AMWA's collection. The next woman artist has 2 pieces in AMWA's collection and is one of the more recognized names within American art. Born November 15, 1887, Georgia O'Keefe's parents, Ida and Francis O'Keefe, took notice of their child's early developments in school and especially in art. From an early age, quote, she received private instruction, and at 18, O'Keefe began formal studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, end quote. This consisted of conventional European curriculum that emphasized drawing from casts, life drawing, and still life painting. A year later, she attended the Art Students League of New York, where she continued this academic style and studied under William Merritt Chase, Kenyon Cox, and F. Lewis Mora. As O'Keefe's education was centered in America, she was not oblivious to the modernist movement that was gaining popularity on the international stage. While living in New York, O'Keefe was able to view work that was from Europe. Through visiting exhibitions, she started to appreciate this modern approach of art. She began to study under Arthur Wesley Dow, a professor at Columbia University Teachers College in New York. Dow was, quote, dissatisfied with academic art studies in France, so he had formulated an Americanized approach to color and composition, end quote. He worked in abstract, two-dimensional styles that encouraged invention and self-expression with oriental patterning, simplification, and harmony. She applied this approach by focusing on colors and shapes to convey her emotions. This transition of technique and style was what she had been looking for to define her own artistic form. The earliest work she produced in this modernist style were modest. She began with charcoal drawings and watercolors. Quote, she produced primarily serene images of nature that relied on her sensitive arrangement of elements for their emotive power, end quote. By applying multiple modernist approaches into a single artistic form, is what classifies O'Keefe's early work as one of the first forms of pure abstraction by an American-born artist. O'Keefe became a frontrunner within the modernist movement based off of her early charcoal drawings. Georgia O'Keeffe's first show was in 1916 at Alfred Stieglitz's Gallery, 291. This was, however, not the only interaction between the two artists. In 1918, O'Keeffe relocated to New York City because of her friendship and blooming love affair with Stieglitz. They had been writing to each other before and after the show in 1916. The couple was married in 1924. Their relationship was struggling when they began visiting Lake George. She viewed his family being intruders to her personal life and her work. She also wanted a child, which he did not. He had a daughter from a previous marriage, and he took this option off the table as this child was institutionalized due to medical reasons. This forced O'Keeffe to focus more on her work, which in turn gained her more ground as an artist in the American scene. Stieglitz employed a loosely Freudian vocabulary to position her as a woman artist whose work embodies female anatomy and eroticism. This early promotion of her work is why today many people see female eroticism and a female principle in almost all of her work. O'Keeffe, however, admittedly rejected this interpretation throughout her life. She was adopted as a heroine for the feminist movement. This association was hard for O'Keeffe because she supported feminist movements, but she refused to associate her work with all-female shows in the 1960s because she wanted recognition as an artist, not a female artist. O'Keeffe's painted the landscape that surrounded her. With her move to New York, she painted cityscapes and skyscrapers, the Radiator Building being one of them. She would summer at Lake George, which led her to subjects of abstract flowers, water, and rolling hills. O'Keeffe consistently kept her subject matter moving and altering into other themes, an attempt to change the sexual narrative around her work and her persona. Starting in 1929, she started taking trips to New Mexico. Her paintings began to be inspired by indigenous and adobe style. She spent most of her time in New Mexico after her first visit. Her marriage was over at this point in time, but they stayed married and wrote letters to one another. She moved permanently to New Mexico after Stieglitz's death in 1949. Art historians say that, quote, as her familiarity with a particular place increased, O'Keeffe produced less representational and more interpretive works, exploring various aspects of the environment and her emotional reaction to them, end quote. This is seen in the two works of hers in the collection. Another church, Hernandez, New Mexico, seen on the upper left, was painted 4 years before Red Hill's Gray Sky on the bottom right, which is significantly more abstract in its simplified and monochromatic depictions of the red dirt landscape of the region. O'Keeffe won the Medal of Freedom in Art on January 10, 1977. She was almost completely blind at this point, but continued to work using assistance and pulling subjects from her memory of the landscape. O'Keeffe passed away on March 6, 1986, at the age of 98, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Her health was deteriorating before then, but her travels that occurred later on in life and her memories of the landscape she knew so well allowed her to create new work up until she died. The Southwest drew in many modern artists, just like the next one, Gina Knee. Knee was inspired by a New York show of John Marin's New Mexico watercolor paintings in 1930. She set out for New Mexico the following year to learn how to paint, having never been a practicing artist before that. Gina was recently divorced at the time and was seeking to restart her life. Some art historians have argued that her trip out to New Mexico was a pilgrimage in a way. She went to Taos to study with Ward Lockwood, a known protege of John Marin's. She chose watercolor as her medium. Marin and Lockwood's work are also in the museum's collection and on view currently, and they can also be viewed here on this slideshow. Please note that the Lockwood in the collection is not an example of his watercolors. Knee aspired to depict the forces and flux of nature. The medium of watercolor, being quick drawing, allows her images to give a sense of movement with her brushstroke, as well as a sense of spontaneity. Gina met her future husband, Ernest Knee, in Arizona. They married in 1933 and moved to Santa Fe. They were welcomed into the artist community there. This provided Gina with a depth of material, including people and landscape. It also provided her with a social artistic atmosphere to learn and develop as an artist. As early as 1933, Gina Knee was exhibiting work at the New Mexico Museum of Art. She also was part of the artist group that formed the Rio Grande Painters. This group exhibited at a gallery in Santa Fe and organized traveling exhibitions. In 1934, Knee was elected president and served in the position until 1938 when the group dismantled. Gina's early work was representational, but over time her paintings began to include non-representational forms. By 1935, her paintings began to show real freedom and a loosened, simplified style. She said, quote, "Through the 30s and up to 45, I painted everything I could see, the desert and mountains. But after a few years of exploring what I saw objectively, I started painting more abstractly, trying to express in the forms their spirit or sound or smell, a more complete picture of a sensual statement, as important as the form," end quote. In the spring of 1938, the Denver Art Museum presented Gina Knee's first solo show. By the end of the decade, she was exhibited throughout the nation with favorable review. Her work was exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Los Angeles Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1943, her career was well established, but her marriage was over. She left Santa Fe and moved back to the East Coast, eventually marrying artist Alexander Brooke. Knee spoke of New Mexico very fondly, even after leaving. Quote, "I never got over New Mexico, the landscape, the mesas, mountains, the green, and the tan," end quote. I think near Cordova, New Mexico, depicted here really captures that essence of New Mexico. The final artist, like me, was very inspired by the light and colors of the Southwest. Helen Frankenthaler is known as a key artist in the abstract expressionist movement in the United States. More specifically, Frankenthaler is associated with what is known as the second generation of abstract expressionism, or the New York School. This generation of artists are those that maintained and studied from the success of the first generation artists, such as William de Kooning and Jackson Pollock, all notably male and supported by art critic Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg. The second generation, noted by Frankenthaler herself, was often pulled to either de Kooning's or Pollock's style. De Kooning's style was more structured, and artists in the city had more access to him and his work as he maintained residency in New York City, whereas Pollock's style was more fluid and experimental as he relocated to East Hampton in upstate New York. Frankenthaler spoke to the mimicking of de Kooning's work by the second generation artists as mirroring by his disciples, whereas one could use Pollock as a starting point for new styles and experimentations. Frankenthaler's work as the original artist that she is recognized for today lived between these two first-generation artists, mimicking neither. Frankenthaler's body of work is recognized for large-scale canvases in addition to her experimental techniques explored throughout her career. Born in New York City in 1928, Frankenthaler was the youngest daughter of a Supreme Court justice in New York. With her father's position, she was raised with much privilege and wealth in New England. The Frankenthaler family would spend summers in Maine, travel internationally, and sought elite educational opportunities for their children. Her earliest education was at the Horace Mann and Brearley School, where other prominent artists and art collectors' children attended. While attending Dalton School in New York, Helen was exposed to Rufina Tamayo, a noted Mexican abstract and surrealist painter. The family lived in New York, where she was familiar with local museums and galleries, living blocks away from MoMA, the Old Guggenheim, and 57th Street galleries. These early exposures to the arts and her family's prominent name in New York afforded Helen artistic opportunities and the privilege to experiment when she first entered onto the scene as a second-generation abstract expressionist artist. Her stylistic experimentations awarded her attention from critics such as Clement Greenberg and fellow artists such as Hans Hofmann, whom she studied under with later. After extensive artistic study under Cubist painter Paul Freely at Bennington College in Vermont, Frankenthaler went on to pursue her graduate degree at Columbia, where she eventually turned in her academic hat for her studio. Greenberg would serve as a friend, lover, and mentor in Frankenthaler's life, bridging the gap between her early education in Cubism and abstract expressionism, introducing her to other artists such as Pollock. In seeing Pollock's studio, as she had the means and the social connection to do so, Frankenthaler adopted action painting by laying her canvas on the floor where she would sit, lay, and even walk across it. She developed her own technique of soak staining, which is created by spreading diluted paint onto unprimed canvases, which then would create softened tones that soaked into the canvas, mimicking the process of watercolors on paper. Landscape readings of her work are common by art historians. Frankenthaler makes many statements in interviews denying the connection of her work with landscapes, in addition to commenting on how it limits a viewer's engagement with the work, going as far as saying, quote, "Landscape is a loaded question for an abstract painter. Looking specifically for figures or landscapes in abstraction can sometimes inhibit the ability to recognize a picture's true quality," end quote. Frankenthaler warns against viewing her work seeking landscape, as it will limit one's depth into a work. She has created paintings that go beyond landscapes as pure subject and only uses the natural world as a source of inspiration. Frankenthaler made her first trip to the Southwest in 1976 to Phoenix, Arizona, to give a lecture at the Phoenix Art Museum. There is little written of the trip or on the series of paintings that followed. The trip was brief, and she did not produce any paintings while in Arizona. Due to the color and titles used in paintings made after the trip, critics have often tied works with red, orange, pink tones to the Phoenix landscape, resulting in an inconclusion of the number of works produced in the series. During her lecture, Frankenthaler is quoted as stating she had gained many new titles from her short time in the Southwest, but no paintings. It is important to note that the two paintings mentioned in this talk from the Phoenix series were created in her East Coast studio, rather than being produced while being exposed to the landscape of the Southwest. One of the first works that Frankenthaler produced after her trip to Phoenix was Phoenix 1976. Though one could absolutely jump into the painting through the title, the painting itself completely lacks figural forms or representation. It is a good example of her second return in 1972 to color field and linear painting that she would create with tape in order to leave raw canvas exposed to lay in other colors. In this piece, the subject is color and the linear vertical structures of color rather than any representational form. One can see the variation in the soaking of the canvas in the burnt sienna red as it has dried lighter in some areas than in others. In this piece, Frankenthaler chose to use acrylic paint in applying her soak stain technique, producing a more saturated hue. Her experimentation with acrylics using her soak stain technique began in the mid-1960s, where one can see her colors intensify. Within the raw canvas and the linear application of deep purple and pink, the end of the squeegee and brush strokes are visible. The color and the application of this color are what make up the composition, nothing more. These colors have reference to the Southwest in the red rock and red dirt, in relation to adobe, to a sunset or sunrise, but any association is dependent on the viewer's experience. For some, it might not have any reference even in sourcing color from the Southwest if one has never experienced these tones in that location. The title does reflect location, however. The painting's composition does not. It reflects the two-dimensionality of its form, rooting itself in how the artist handles the space of the canvas, but nothing beyond that. Phoenix 1976 also breaks the horizontal nature that is associated with Frankenthaler's landscape style paintings. The vertical nature of her lines and canvas is not rare for the artist, but critics often leave vertical pieces that reference landscape after a trip or in title out of their dissection of landscape elements within her painting. Frankenthaler would approach her canvases from every side and rotate them, never concluding on the orientation of the piece till the very end of her experimentation, if she ever did, countering the assumption of the interpretations and experience of place being purely representative of landscape as a horizontal canvas. Frankenthaler states, quote, "When one looks at an abstract horizontal canvas, one consciously perceives nature or a horizon or a view. One is not apt to think of a figurative reference, which is more apt to be vertical," end quote. She is not speaking to how she uses the direction of the canvas. She is speaking to how critics and a viewer assign perception onto a piece based upon its hanging. By consistently creating both horizontal and vertical canvases, she can play and disjoint the assigned perceptions. Though a horizontal canvas, Into the West, painted in 1977, is another painting of Frankenthaler's that is sourcing color predominantly. Like Phoenix 1976, this is a piece that is saturated in bright orange-red with translucent line applications of dark brown and black that allows the intensity of the base color to seep through. This painting was difficult in that she kept working paint into it and making corrections as it was drying. Frankenthaler speaks to how this piece was painted rather than tinted through soak stain. She initially applied the paint with a sponge head in full body arm movements across the canvas. In order to create the saturation that is present in the bright red orange pink color, she remembers having to almost beat the pigment into the canvas, which was something new for her. The process in which she used was experimental and varies drastically from the soak stain applied to Phoenix 1976. Though both paintings explore similar red, orange, pink hues and are painted at a similar time, by pursuing different acrylic paint applications within a similar palette, one can see that Frankenthaler was exploring the possibilities that these colors and techniques had in creating unique compositions. She is taking elements of her experience with the Southwest and introducing them into her artistic practice, pushing herself and her mode of production to evolve in order to reach a color or a sense that she has repurposed from the land. Frankenthaler took Pollock's approach to painting a step further by discovering new techniques within action painting. At the time of her first soak stain painting, Mountains and Sea, Morris Louis is quoted referring to Frankenthaler as, quote, a bridge between Pollock and what is possible, end quote. Even with Lewis's credit to Frankenthaler's work, her experimentation and pursuance of the new are often left out of her narrative as an artist and her importance to abstract expressionism and color field painting. Frankenthaler's Phoenix is one of the only purely abstract expressionist paintings in the collection because of her romantic relationship with art critic Clement Greenberg. She received her first solo exhibition at the age of 23 in 1951. Frankenthaler is one of the better known women abex artists, and her artworks are in many private and public collections across the world. Frankenthaler passed December 27, 2011, at the age of 83. Her experimentation and artistic techniques left a lasting legacy on American art, modern and contemporary, and within scholarship, she is picked up quite often as a woman artist deserving of the same attention and credit as her male peers. All of the artists discussed today made great contributions to American art and its legacy within the art world. Unfortunately, they are often left out of the canon or scope of this art history. But today's conversation is just a glimpse of the many women artists working on producing art in the United States, specifically engaging with the Western United States region. Thank you for joining us this evening.